Hello. This presentation is going to be about France's first set of military interventions in Chad, and the one following this will be about French military interventions in Chad from the 1980s to the present day. Uh, Today, I'm just going to cover the first 20 years of Chad's independence, so roughly 1960 to 1982 or so, and it's a fairly complicated political narrative, and in a lot of ways, it's more complicated than what follows. So you're gonna have to bear with me, and feel free to pause or go back or have a look at the readings I'm suggesting, because it's not a series of conflicts and interventions that have a sort of linear structure to them, and it's ultimately why I wrote a book about them. So bear with me, and I hope you enjoy. So, early post-colonial Chad, so from 1960 onwards, 1960s to the 1970s, like many of France's former colonies, was a state that was intimately connected to its former colonizer. Beyond its continued dependence on France as an export market, a source of imports and finance, French personnel also pervaded the early Chadian state's political and security institutions. I mentioned a bit of this in earlier talks. France also maintained a major base at the airport of Fort Lamy, which was the original name of Djambena, Chad's capital. French forces in the country totaled around 3,000 troops until 1965, and the far northern Borkou-Enedi-Tibesti region, which is known as the BET, remained under French military administration until 1965 as well. So 5 years after independence, the northern half of Chad was still administered by the French, although nominally part of independent Chad. Um, Although there was a military reorganization of France's overseas forces in 1965, which reduced the French military presence to 1,000 troops in Chad, Paris and Fort Lamy remained linked by a defense agreement, which included a secret clause outlining the modalities of a French intervention for the domestic maintenance of order in case of rebellion or another threat to the regime. And in such a situation, the entire Chadian military would pass directly under French command. So you can see how Chad's security was still deeply vested in the hands of French elites and the French military, in fact. So this presence and security guarantee it implied to Chadian President Francois Tombobai, and he's the fellow right there you see on the screen, uh, removed any need that he had to diversify the regime's social and regional base by reaching out to otherwise marginalized communities, particularly Muslims in northern Chad. So if you remember, Tombobai himself was from southern Chad and represented a largely Sera kind of ethnic constituency, as well as the economic interests of southern Chad, which largely relied on cotton production. This marginalization of the North fostered an environment which encouraged Tambelbai to remove opposition figures and movements, as well as to centralize authority under the banner of his single party, the Parti Progressiste Chadien, which I talked about in the last presentation. The consolidation of Tombobai's early post-colonial regime occurred in the context of severe fiscal constraints to state building due to the poor economy. And I mentioned this same thing was happening under colonial rule as well, where the French colonial authorities couldn't expect a lot of financial help from Paris, so had to really try to raise as much revenue as they could in Chad itself, which of course was a very poor colony, which meant, of course, excessive tax burdens on people living there. So this led for Tombobai himself, just like it did to its colonial predecessors, to very aggressive efforts to maximize tax revenues. And given the country's overall poverty, and combined with Tombobai's geographically limited political constituency in the south, you can imagine this generated considerable resentment. So in October, November 1965, end of October, beginning of November, a rebellion broke out in central Chad. And this rebellion, see right here, unfortunately the map is smaller than I'd like, but the rebellion occurred in Mangalme, which at the time was in Gera Prefecture. It was in Bata Prefecture, now it's in Gera Prefecture. Uh, this rebellion, which was in reality not just a single rebellion, but it was a dispersed series of local uprisings. It began with a peasant revolt against excessive tax collection by government authorities. And the following year, this kind of dispersed set of uprisings or insurgencies began to organize, and the umbrella organization, which kind of supervised or uh, kind of covered this group of uprisings was called the Front de Libération Nationale du Tchad, or FROLINA, the Chadian National Liberation Front. This organization brought together a very eclectic mix of sort of socialist left-wing Chadian exiles, as well as more conservative Muslim elites and local chiefs, as well as some Islamist figures from Egypt related to the Muslim Brotherhood. So it was a really diverse collection of different political and even cultural backgrounds that got involved in this uprising against the Chadian regime. And this occurred in central and eastern Chad, so in Batha and Gera prefectures, and as well in Wadai, which is right on the border of Sudan. Okay, now this kind of for the first couple of years, this was not considered to be a serious threat to the regime, and it remained at a somewhat of a low intensity for the first 2 or 3 years of the rebellion. But it made it difficult for the state to govern or collect taxes in central and eastern Chad. Um, However, 3 years later, in 1968, another rebellion erupted in the BET, so that's far northern Chad. And this revolt was in part provoked by central government efforts to sedentarize the Tubu populations who live there by trying to impose crop cultivation in palm groves and other areas which were devoid of significant quantities of arable land, which made it very difficult for anybody living up there to, farm in any kind of substantial manner. The Tubu themselves had also been subjected to a range of abuses from the new government administrators who had replaced the French that had left in 1965. And all these administrators were Southerners. Now, a combination of violence and threats against the local population pushed the Derde, who was an important customary and religious figure among the Teda, who were the Tubu of Tibesti, and Tibesti is in the far northeast of Chad, pushed him to flee across the border into Libya, and as well as several thousand Tubu. And one of his sons, Gukuni Wedai, would soon become one of the most important rebel leaders in the BET. Now, in March 1968, Tubu rebels besieged a government garrison in the village of Uzu, near the Libyan border. And you can see it very top of the map there. And after several failed efforts to relieve the settlement in August 1968, the Chadian president, Tombo Bai, called for French assistance. He invoked the Franco-Chadian Defense Accords, and the French responded positively. Although the French army and air force deployed, they didn't need to intervene directly. The two rebels themselves withdrew with the appearance of the French, and the Chadian army units managed to retake Uzu without a fight. Following this action, though, Captain Pierre Galopin, who was a French intelligence officer on detached duty as a deputy head of Chad's intelligence agency, who was headed by another French intelligence officer named Camille Gourvenec, who we'll talk a bit about later. He took charge of negotiations which aimed to divide the Tubu rebellion by co-opting some of its leadership and therefore weakening it and making it easier prey for Tombo Bai's regime. And although he was successful in securing some major defections, this divide and rule strategy pushed the Derde's faction. The Derde was a guy who fled into Libya, of the rebellion into a complete opposition, and it joined FROLINA, which was the main rebellion in central Chad, and it joined it as its second army. So army was perhaps an exaggerated term for it, but the main organization overseeing the various Chadian uprisings now had two components: the second army in the far north and the first army in central and eastern Chad. So by early 1969, so the following year, the rebellion in central and eastern Chad itself had grown to alarming proportions from the French and Chadian government perspective. Officials in the French Cooperation Ministry, which was in charge of kind of all bilateral and multilateral relationships between France and its former colonies, particularly in terms of economic and military assistance, they argued that without a French intervention, Tombo Bai's regime would not last another 6 months. In March 1969, Tombo Bai requested help from Paris again, and although French observers had no illusions about who was responsible for this unrest, for Charles de Gaulle, who was the French president, now in the final weeks of his presidency, France needed to stand by its defense commitments to maintain credibility with other closer African clients. The fear was that if France did not respond to Tombo Bai's request for protection, that other French clients in Africa, particularly Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Gabon, who were particularly close to France, might try to look for other protectors or might not trust the French as being reliable partners in the future. And furthermore, he feared that instability in Chad, if it got out of hand, could spread elsewhere, therefore threatening France's former colonial domain. And he felt thus that he had no other option than to intervene in Tombouctai's defense. It should be said he didn't have a very high opinion of Tombouctou or the Chadian government, but he thought that France needed to intervene to stop the contagion, so to speak, from spreading. So, given the causes of the rebellion, the French intervention included both a military and a civilian dimension. And the first included, of course, increased support to Chadian security forces, which should be reorganized and commanded by French officers, as well as initially small reinforcement of French troops from France. And the second part, the civilian component, involved the creation of a mission for administrative reform. A French general, Michel Arnaud, who was later replaced by another guy named Edouard Corte-Dallas, was attached to Tombouctou as his official military advisor, but de facto commander of the Chadian military, and was in charge of leading the military effort. And then a former French colonial governor named Pierre Lamy led the mission for administrative reform. Now, the MRA, which was the Mission for Administrative Reform, they looked to remove abusive Chadian officials and to retrain others. And it also became one of the only state-building exercises that was attached to a French military intervention in post-colonial Africa. So this became a real sort of counterinsurgency project in a way that other French interventions were not until arguably 2013, 2014. Now, Lamy, the former governor who was the head of the mission of administrative reform, he presented himself to Tombouctou as an expert in decolonization. As a former colonial governor who had overseen the transition from colonialism to independence of a number of African states, and described decolonization itself as being at the heart of the problem. And he wrote to Tombouctou that this consisted in, I'm quoting, sorting out and making a choice in the administrative legacy left by the colonizer. But in actuality, what he really wanted to do, and his main policies that he tried to put in place, and tried to reorganize the Chadian state, was to return to the kind of policies the French had used to keep to pacify Chad and to keep the country under centralized control. So, whereas Tombouctou had sought to, like many African leaders, newly independent African leaders, had sought to centralize state authority by removing power from customary chiefdoms, which had served as sort of pillars of colonial rule, Lamy was pushing for them to be reinstated. That is, local elites who would run local affairs, whose positions might be inherited or at least named by the government officials, but were not particularly accountable to the local population in any kind of institutional way. Lamy also pushed for the creation of a multitude of self-defense groups, so it's like village-level militias, who would serve to undermine Frontenac control over rural populations and contribute to French-led counterinsurgency efforts. So Lamy's recommendations and MRA attempts to force this major change in Chadian public administration threaten the privileges and authorities of government elites, as you can imagine. So soon French officials were reporting that Chadian administrators were trying to outmaneuver the French or sabotage MRA initiatives. And less than a year after it was created, so in March or April 1969, these obstacles sparked a crisis in Franco-Chadian relations. Lamy himself was not a particularly patient person, and he wrote a very angry letter to Paris, demanding the total replacement of all Chadian government administrators with French bureaucrats. And somebody helpfully leaked this letter to Tombouctou and to the press, and Tombouctou immediately asked that Lamy be removed and replaced. So his successor, who was another former colonial official, took the reins of an agency which was now stripped of its state-building ambitions and just became kind of another development agency. And it now began to focus on building infrastructure and rather than taking an overtly political role. The control of militias and the more military dimension was then transferred to control of the French general at the time, Corte-Dallas. So what needs to be emphasized here, though, is that although the MRA and the French in general had abandoned their efforts to reform the Chadian administration and government, Lamy's success in devolving power to chiefly authorities, and especially local militias, would contribute to lasting violence and insecurity in central and eastern Chad throughout the next decade. Because in a lot of ways, this handed state authority to local actors who use it for their own interests, and this ultimately, and in some ways fatally, weakened the state. in the service of kind of short-term interests of defeating an insurgency. So now I'm going to talk about the military dimension of France's intervention, which rapidly transformed from just a simple military assistance and advisory effort into a full-blown intervention called Opération Limousin. So this picture here is an image from some of a French patrol in eastern Chad. Because of the condition of the roads and especially in the rainy season, it was very difficult to move around in vehicles. At the beginning, French air mobility was somewhat limited, so French Foreign Legion troops especially took to riding on horses as part of their patrolling efforts. And this it's a picture from a patrol from the Second Foreign Legion Regiment, the Deuxième REP, the Foreign Airborne Regiment. So, beginning in April of 1969, the very beginning of the intervention, several Foreign Legion companies arrived in the country from the Deuxième REP, the Second RAP, and they launched clearing operations against Frolinat formations in central Chad. In total, the French military presence would peak at around 2,800 troops, which included about 600 advisors on detached service with Chadian security forces to both train and lead them. And by September 1972, when the operation formally came to an end, Franco-Chadian forces succeeded in destroying or dismantling most of the Frolinat First Army, which was in central and eastern Chad, and restoring it to nominal state authority, even though, in fact, much of that part of the country came under the control of local elites and local chiefs. Partly, French success came as a result of superior French firepower, as well as divisions within Frolinat's leadership, its lack of sufficient weapons, and a complete dearth of external support. Plus, because they didn't have proper communications equipment like radios, the distances they had to travel from one unit to another, or one group of insurgents to another, was really too far and too difficult for proper coordination of operations. So this meant that ultimately the rebels were defeated in a lot of ways because of their own weaknesses rather than French strengths. And part of this also, I should note, related to French air power as well, which grew over time. And the French used a fairly large number of helicopters and ground attack aircraft to disperse larger rebel formations and make it more difficult for them to organize in kind of larger numbers that could threaten, for example, towns or larger municipalities. So though that part of the intervention was, I don't want to call it easy, but was within about 6 months or 8 months, the French had largely reestablished some kind of control over central eastern Chad. The fighting in the north, the BET, proved a lot more difficult. In late 1970, there was a Second Army offensive by the rebels in northern Chad, the BET, which led the French to redirect the resources to the BET. And although they were able to beat the rebels back in a series of very bloody skirmishes in October and November of that year, the kind of French effort at a sweeping counteroffensive came up short, as Second Army formations managed to effectively disperse to avoid the full brunt of French firepower. Fighting was fierce. French forces lost the majority of their troops the majority of the casualties were in northern Chad. Overall, during their intervention, they lost 39 killed and 102 wounded during the 3 years of fighting there, and 3/4 of these losses occurred in the BET, and this included 12 who were killed in a single ambush in October 1970, including, I should add, the son of the commander of the French Expeditionary Force, General Crotodelas. Chadian losses are harder to determine. There was a Dutch anthropologist who tried, Robert Buitenhuis. He estimated that around 10,000 Chadians lost their lives during this period. French official figures give a figure of around 5,100 rebels, including 3,800 killed for the entire 1969 to 72 period. And Chadian security forces suffered 300 dead, 300 wounded, and 42 missing. Again, it's hard to know because there were, especially with the later use of French air power and the Chadian army's tendency to not discriminate between civilians and combatants, meant that losses may have been more severe. Plus, the disruption caused by military efforts caused a lot of population displacement, which would have led to kind of more difficult access to food and medical attention, which would have led to much higher excess death totals than the official figures would show. Um, there was also several major allegations against the French Foreign Legion for brutality against Chadian civilians. Here's an excerpt from the New York Times of a soldier kicking a dying Chadian on the ground. There were a number of allegations that were published in French newspapers. Of course, Frolina, the rebel group, made lots of hay out of these, and it was a major, essential element of their propaganda, their anti-French propaganda. The French were responsible for all sorts of human rights abuses against Chadian civilians, particularly in Central and Eastern Chad. And later, researchers who spent time in northern Chad later in that decade, in the 1980s, often wrote about how Franco-Chadian military operations had left very deep emotional and psychological scars among the Tubu in Tibesti. And part of this related to the widespread use of napalm against palm groves, which, although the French military initially denied, the archives that have been declassified since then have shown that it was used pretty systematically against palm groves in northern Chad, and this not only would have killed people, but also would have destroyed the livelihoods of lots of individuals who relied on the benefits of palm groves for their survival. So the French military officially ended its operation in September 1972, and while a sizable French contingent remained in the country, its mission transformed into one focused on logistical assistance and air support. And the French presence within Chad's military and security apparatus also persisted, and the head of French military assistance donned a Chadian uniform and became the official military advisor to President Tombouctou, and again, the unofficial or de facto head of the Chadian military. Furthermore, at this point, France continued to provide tens of millions of francs worth of military aid, which included weapons, munitions, equipment, and training. From 1960 until 1974, so this 14-year period, this totaled something like 440 million French francs, which did not include the cost of military operations. And this accounted for about 40% of France's entire military assistance in Africa in the post-colonial period, or in the post-colonial decade and a half. So 40% of all French post-colonial military assistance went to Chad. Partly because of Chad's conflicts, and partly because of France's growing involvement in the country as it increasingly saw Chad as a broader destabilization in Africa. So, at the same time, the French withdrew, or partly withdrew, or at least formally ended their combat operations. Frolina had suffered a severe military defeat. Pockets of resistance remained, though, especially in the BET, where its organizational infrastructure had survived intact. And that's important to remember. Now, there was a relative calm which followed France's first intervention in Chad, but this was broken in April 1974. So just 2 years after, or even really a year and a half after formal combat operations ended for the French, when elements of the Frolina's Second Army, so the rebels in northern Chad and the BET, who now had renamed themselves the Forces Armées du Nord, the Northern Armed Forces, which was led by Goukouni Wede, who was the son of the Derde, the guy who had fled into Libya as a result of Chadian government abuses. So it was led by Goukouni Wede and another very famous northern Chadian, Hissène Habré, who was also Tubu. And they abducted a French archaeologist named Françoise Claustre, who you see in the picture, an MRA official, so an official from the French Administrative Reform Mission, which continued after the French military intervention, named Marc Combe, and a German doctor as well. Now, this kidnapping, which exploited the power vacuum in France, which occurred between the death due to cancer of President Georges Pompidou in early April 1974, and his successor, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was elected in May 1974, this would seriously undermine Franco-Chadian relations. So, while the doctor, who was German, was soon released in exchange for a ransom, which was paid by the West Germans, there was a difficult set of negotiations between French authorities and the northern rebels in order to try to secure the liberation of the freedom of the two French hostages there. This, as you can imagine, fueled Tombouctou's suspicion, the Chadian president's suspicions about what the French were up to. Uh, he was afraid that France would succumb to rebel demands for ransom and would pressure him for the liberation of political prisoners held by the Chadian regime. So, in response, the Chadian president requested that Pierre Galopin, who had been the guy who had initially negotiated with the Toubou rebellion to co-opt part of it, um, who was part of the Chadian Intelligence Agency, the CCER, he requested that he lead the negotiations. So, given his familiarity with the Toubou and his close ties with the head of Chadian intelligence and Toubou himself, it looked like he was a good choice. He knew northern Chad very well. He had served there in the military before independence, and he seemed like a good interlocutor because he was very close to Chadian authorities and also was a serving French officer and a member of Chad's intelligence services. French authorities agreed to this, despite warnings that both Goukouni and Habré had personal grudges against him for his role in quote-unquote dividing the Toubou during his negotiations and efforts to co-opt part of the rebellion in 1968 and early 1969. Goukouni himself had blamed Toubou's diplomatic success for the later death of several of his brothers, who were killed in clashes with former rebels who then redefected back to the government side. So during talks between Galopin and Habré, Habré decided to seize Galopin and add him to the hostage pool. So in retrospect, this probably wasn't a good idea. He later just justified his action by claiming that Galopin had attempted to use the negotiations to pretext to further divide the rebellion by soliciting defections from the rebellion. And documents that I found in the French Foreign Ministry archives, which included notes written to Galopin by the Chadian intelligence chief, show that was at least part of it. That was part of his instructions. His instructions did involve trying to incite divisions within the rebellion itself and try to secure the redefection of some of the rebel leadership. So Habré's accusations were not off the mark. At any rate, Galopin was now a prisoner, and the FAN, now the Forces Armées du Nord, the Northern Rebellion, which now takes the initials FAN, they demanded to be supplied with firearms in addition to a hefty ransom payment, and they subsequently threatened to execute Galopin if their demands were not met. So in the absence of clear French response to the ultimatum several months later, Habré actually did execute Galopin, who was killed on April 4th, 1975. And this would have some lasting repercussions. So, unrelatedly, a week later, April 13th, Tumbleby was overthrown and killed in a bloody coup, along with his wife and much of his entourage. The coup leaders, who were mostly military officers, threatened by arrest by Tumbleby, and therefore they reacted very badly to these threats and overthrew him, denounced the former regime's excesses and formed a Conseil Supérieur Militaire, which is called the CSM, the new military government, under the leadership of General Félix Malum. Now, given Tumbleby's past intransigence on a number of issues, French policymakers viewed this as something of a positive development, and the French military garrison in the capital received an explicit order not to intervene to save Tumbleby when the coup actually broke out. And there's some speculation about French involvement in the coup itself, although I never found any evidence for it when I was going through the archives. Now, Galopin's death and regime change in N'Djamena, which was the new name of the capital of Chad. Tumbleby had changed the name in 1973 to a more quote-unquote African name. This led French authorities to intensify their negotiations with the Northern Rebellion, initially with the agreement of the Chadian military authorities. In May, though, of 1975, one of the French hostages, Malcolm, managed to escape, and that left only one hostage left in the hands of Habré and Goukouni. Françoise Cloustre, who was a French archaeologist, the woman you saw in the previous photo. Now, as part of these negotiations, Giscard, the French president, authorized Cloustre's husband, and he was also the former head of the French Administrative Reform Mission, Pierre Cloustre, to purchase firearms on behalf of the FAN rebels in order to secure her release using ransom money. It would be deducted from the ransom money. So soon, the CSM, the Chadian military government, discovered the operation, and this, combined with further French deliveries of ransom payments and supplies via aircraft drops, this infuriated Malum, the Chadian president. The CSM accused French authorities of violating Chadian sovereignty, And on September 27th, 1975, Maloum ordered the expulsion of all French forces from Chad and demanded the renegotiation of all existing cooperation and defense agreements. So, although these agreements would be signed between France and Chad in the following year, 1976, French policymakers now changed their strategy to obtain the release of Françoise Crostre. And now her husband, Pierre Crostre, who the fan had decided to retain as well as the cat as a hostage, because the firearms he delivered proved to be of poor quality and probably were deliberately of poor quality because the French did not have any intention of delivering state-of-the-art light weapons to the Northern Rebellion in Chad. So, in consequence, the Chadian rebels not only took the ransom payments, but also kept him as a hostage. Now, Giscard and his advisors decided to resort to Libyan mediation rather than negotiate with the fan directly or rely on the CSM. And since the French forces were no longer in the country, they had been expelled, they had little leverage over the Chadian government, and they didn't have many resources within Chad itself to conduct negotiations in any way outside of Chadian government auspices. So, since Gaddafi had come to power in 1969, he had attempted to expand Libyan influence into Chad, and in 1971, at the latest, he began to provide some levels of assistance, to the Chadian rebels in northern Chad, the Second Army, later the FAN. And in 1973, he occupied a northern ribbon of territory called the Ouzou Strip that included Ouzou, but a ribbon of territory along Libya's border. So, because of that, French officials felt that the northern rebels might respond more readily to Libyan pressure than from anybody else. Of course, dealing with Gaddafi in that circumstance would have lasting repercussions on Chad. Now, the FAN, the Northern Rebellion, they had a difficult position themselves. They were stuck between a government in N'Djamena, which they opposed and had been fighting for a decade and a half now, and growing Libyan ambitions on the north, in the BET. So they're pulled between competing threats and options, and this led to growing tensions within the rebel movement itself. Hissène Habré, was viscerally anti-Libyan, and he resented Libyan interference and wanted to fight against the occupation of the Ouzou Strip. He saw the Libyans as a more clear and present danger than the Chadian government. Goukouni, on the other hand, whose father had fled to Libya, felt that Folignac could not handle a two-front war, and should therefore focus his efforts against the Chadian government. So this conflict, combined with personality clashes and ethnic tensions between different clans of the Tubu, and also Arab combatants within the Second Army, led Habré to split from Goukouni with his supporters. And Habré kept the acronym. This is where it gets really confusing. There's lots of acronyms here. Kept the FAN acronym for himself. So from now on, until the end of time, Habré's soldiers will be known as the FAN, the Forces Armées du Nord. So when I say FAN and Habré, that is the same kind of organization. The FAN acronym for his own troops. And Habré moved his forces out of Tibesti and towards central Chad, and eventually, under heavy government assaults in mid-1977, he crossed into Sudan, where he had some connections with the Sudanese government. So, meanwhile, in response to French requests, so here you see a picture of Goukouni and Habré. The French call them frères ennemis, so brothers and enemies. They weren't actually brothers, but they were at different times throughout the 70s and 80s. They were close allies and viscerally opposed rivals and enemies. So Habré is on the left and Goukouni is on the right. Okay, so in response to French requests and hoping they could get something out of it themselves, Gaddafi offered Goukouni arms, ammunition, and money if he released the Crostre, the husband and wife pair, and Goukouni agreed. So at the end of January 1977, he delivered them to the French embassy in Tripoli. The price France ended up paying for this, at least as Gaddafi would subsequently understand it, would be an implicit French recognition of a Libyan sphere of influence in northern Chad. By linking military assistance to the release of the hostages, Gaddafi was now signaling that from now on he would have a seat at the Chadian table, and Libyan authorities would henceforth become indispensable interlocutors for anyone looking to make peace in northern Chad, which would soon break out. Now, go back a second. So, with Libyan aid, Goukouni increased recruitment and rearmed his forces in the first half of 1977. In July, they launched a major offensive which seized the entirety of Tibesti and part of Borku from government hands. French diplomats, again, France no longer had forces in the ground. They tried to push the CSM into a more conciliatory posture towards the Northern Rebellion, but neither Gikouni nor his Libyan backers were open to talks. The same, however, was not true of Hissène Habré. In January 1978, he's now been based in Sudan for a couple of months now, he signed an initial agreement with the CSM in Khartoum, which called for the creation of a provisional government, a new constitution, and elections, and the FAN's integration into the Chadian army. In February 1978, so the following month, Gikouni's forces, which he soon renamed the Forces Armées Populaires, so the FAP, so FAN is Habré and FAP is Gikouni, if you're keeping track. The FAP launched a second offensive, aiming to capture the rest of the BET, and in mid-February they took Fada, the chief town in Enedi, and Faya-Largeau, the capital of the BET. So in the process, they captured some 2,000 government soldiers, and the government lost extensive territory, and the Chadian army at this point was an army on the verge of collapse. Maloum was desperate and tried to reopen negotiations, and under Libyan pressure, Gikouni agreed. These initially seemed catastrophic to the French, because they resulted in sweeping concessions by the CSM at a meeting held in Benghazi at the end of March. They included a ceasefire, a notional free circulation for rebel forces across the country, and a clause which called for a commission which would, quote, account for the presence or absence of troops and foreign military bases. So at this point, France had military advisors, again embedded with Chadian units, although there was no major French military presence in the country. So this clause responded to Gikouni's demands for the expulsion of any French military advisors who were then helping the Chadian army organize the defense of central Chad. With this had two aims. One was to drive a further wedge between the CSM and France, but also because he felt that the only chance the Chadian army had of succeeding in defeating the rebels was with French assistance. French policymakers were absolutely dumbfounded by the CSM's concessions. Louis Dallier, who was the French ambassador in N'Djamena and became a very powerful French influence in Chad, received instructions to tell Maloum that the Benghazi Accord was, quote, incompatible with the continuation of our military assistance. There can be no question of letting our military assistance mission be inspected by an international commission created by an agreement that we are not party to. So the French were basically telling Maloum, like, look, you're either walking back from this agreement or we're out. We're cutting our aid to you, and you might collapse. So Maloum himself was also very unhappy with the agreement, which was negotiated by his vice president, and he walked it back. He had his vice president give a press conference in which he insisted that the Benghazi agreement didn't actually call into question the character and size of French military assistance to the Chadian government. In response, Gikouni declared that the continuation of French military assistance was a breach of the Benghazi agreement, and on April 16th, his forces broke the ceasefire and seized the village of Salal, about 450 kilometers north of N'Djamena. Here's the map. Salal is marked on the map. I don't think you can see my cursor, but it is the northern part of the map. Okay. So Chadian troops based in Musoro, south of Salal, they accompanied their French advisors, and a small contingent of French forces based in N'Djamena counterattacked. And after 3 days of intense skirmishing, the FAP remained in control of the village. Now, the capture of Salal and the ensuing fighting served as a trigger for a much larger French intervention in the presence of just advisory teams and the single armored company that was actually present in the country. Dallier, the Chadian ambassador, he expressed a view, and he really lobbied Paris to say, look, this rebel advance is nothing less than a Libyan invasion by proxy. There's no way that a handful of rebels in the BET could all of a sudden capture half the country and have access to all sorts of heavy weapons without substantial Libyan assistance or even a Libyan military presence alongside of them. This was his argument. Giscard, the French president, agreed wholeheartedly. His view of France's role in Africa emphasized its importance as a pillar against Chad's role France's role. Yeah, France's role in Africa was an important kind of pillar against destabilization of the continent, and he viewed external threats to France's former colonies as a principal source of instability. So, even more than any of his predecessors, his administration was characterized by a very interventionist policy in Africa. So, during his presidency, so from 1974 to 1981, he launched something like 4 or 5 major military interventions. Now, Giscard viewed FAP's capture of Salal as a Libyan attempt to seize Chad and to push France out of this part of its former empire. At the same time, there were a lot of other African allies, French African allies, including political elites in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and Gabon, who actively pressured Giscard to intervene, fearing Gaddafi's ultimate ambitions about overthrowing them as well, perhaps. And Gaddafi had oodles of money because of oil, especially after 1973 and the oil embargo. Gaddafi's Libya was awash in cash, and Gaddafi was using this to fund not just a much larger military, but also all sorts of opposition movements throughout Africa and the Middle East, which caused a lot of anxiety among different heads of state. At the same time, and on the other hand, Giscard's military advisors opposed the intervention. They asserted that neither the limited French forces on the ground nor the Chadian army could protect N'Djamena against a determined rebel attack. And according to General Guy Mery, who was the army chief of staff, the defense of the Chadian capital would have required several thousand French troops. Libyan supplied FAP units were even better armed than some French units, with up-to-date Soviet equipment, and their SA-7 portable surface-to-air missiles made French and Chadian close air support a lot more difficult. Additionally, although it remained unstated, a lot of French officers resented the CSM for their expulsion from Chad 3 years previously, and were not too thrilled about the prospect of saving it. Despite these arguments, Giscard decided to reject advice of his military commanders. He feared that a FAP victory would be, quote, and this quote from his memoirs, a triumph for Gaddafi and a signal rout for the most threatened of our African partners, thus destroying France's credibility as a guarantor of our African allies. So, on April 20th, 1978, the first elements of Operation Taco, which is a kind of fish, deployed to Chad, joining the French advisory mission, and the armored company was already present there. The commander of the operation, the first commander, it had several, General Bradèche, had orders to, quote, break the momentum of victory among the rebels and restore confidence in N'Djamena, which is a very vague objective indeed. Towards the end of May, French forces peaked at some 2,500 troops. Contrary to France's previous intervention, though, its mission was not a counterinsurgency one. Instead, the French army established a defensive line stretching from Moussoro in the west through Mongo in central Chad, you can see it in the map, and reaching Abaché in the far east. This line aimed to prevent new FAP advances, while the Chadian army reorganized with French assistance behind the line. Although French forces would not launch significant operations north of that line, it did repulse several FAP efforts to cross it in May 1978, and it also inflicted heavy losses on the Armée Volcan, which was also, in English, the translation would be like the Volcano Army, which was a faction largely composed of Chadian Arabs under the command of a guy named Ahmed Assil, who had very close ties to Gaddafi. Now, meanwhile, the French line was reinforced by the gradual deployment of fan units under Habré in eastern Chad in accordance with the Khartoum Agreement, which was signed earlier in the year between Habré and Maloum's government. Now, following the stabilization of this front in June 1978, Giscard declared that, quote, the conditions are right for a political solution, and that the objective of French policy was to facilitate one. So the French kind of role here, from their perspective, was to essentially impose a ceasefire on the ground, and that was supposed to lead to a political solution to the conflict. Now, the following months seemed to confirm this diagnosis and this perspective. So in August 1978, the FAP suffered a violent split in Faye al-Aljou. Internal tensions linked to ethnic differences, mainly between Tubu and Arab fighters, combined with disagreements over strategy and the increasing weight of Libyan influence in the BET, led to this break within the organization. And following heavy fighting, the Armée Volcan under Ahmed Assil, the guys who were mostly Arabs and linked to Gaddafi, they separated from the FAP. And Gaddafi broke his ties with Goukouni, while maintaining close links with Assil's forces, the Armée Volcan. And practically at the same time, the Khartoum Accords between Habré and the CSM came into effect that formally integrated the FAN into the government. Now, the CSM was dissolved, and a, quote, fundamental charter, sort of proto-constitution, was signed, outlining the modalities of a provisional government. Maloum kept the presidency, while Habré became prime minister, and this structure would prove deeply unstable. Tensions immediately arose between Maloum and Habré's factions, about the prerogatives of the president versus the prime minister, but also the different kinds of perspectives and past history of Southern government and Northern rebels. It quickly became clear to both the Southerners affiliated with Malum and French observers that Habré aimed to take power. And after several months of increasing friction, fighting broke out in February 1979 between FAN and the former government security forces. In northern Chad, government administrators were killed. These administrators were coming from the south, whereas in the south, hundreds of Muslims were massacred in the southern towns of Sar and Mundu. There's a great poster stamp of Gaddafi. Okay, we're not there yet. All right, so at the beginning of the fighting, French units assumed a posture of strict neutrality, and this neutrality, though, benefited Hissène Habré far more than Félix Malum. French forces prevented Chadian government aircraft from taking off from N'Djamena Airport, which was also the main French military base. And these aircraft were obviously aiming to attack Habré's positions, and French forces stopped them from operating. And this is because Habré's positions lay close to heavy concentrations of civilians. So French actions responded apart from threats from the city's Muslim leaders to dump corpses of dead civilians in front of the French embassy, and French threats from Habré to target French civilians if the French continued to allow these attacks to happen. And since Habré had a history of killing his hostages, I think the French agreed that was probably a smart idea. So at the same time, French instructors who were attached to Chadian army units withdrew in order to not become implicated in the fighting. The problem was that a lot of these instructors were part of the command structures of different Chadian units, and this disrupted these command structures and added to the general confusion on the government side, on the former government side, among Malum's ranks. The intensity of the fighting in N'Djamena caused a mass exodus of something like 70 or 80,000 Southerners out of a total population of 130,000. The French embassy estimated that the February and March fighting alone had cost the lives of 4,000 people in the capital, but the violence was matched elsewhere in the country, particularly in the eastern town of Abaché. And Robert Buitenhuis, a Dutch anthropologist, estimates that the number of deaths for the country as a whole, just in those 2 months, amounted to between 10 and 20,000 people. And if you compare that to the entirety of the death toll from the first kind of major Chadian conflict in the 60s and early 70s, this shows it's illustrative of the intensity of the fighting, but also the fact that the rebels were now using now had access to heavier weapons, which obviously exacted a higher death toll among non-combatants. So, despite their numerical inferiority, the FAN, so Habré's troops, were better organized and better disciplined than the southern rivals, which were now known as the Forces Armées Tchadiennes, the FAT. So they're known as the FAT. The FAT would be the armed forces representing southern Chad. The FAN are Habré's people, and the FAP are Goukouni's rebels. Now, to make matters worse for the FAT, so the southern Chadian armed forces, in the beginning of March, large numbers of FAP combatants, so Goukouni's combatants armed with heavy weapons, entered the capital to join Habré's forces in a renewal of the old Habré-Goukouni alliance. Now, General Louis Forest, who was the commander of French forces in Chad now, he decided not to prevent the entry of Goukouni's forces into Chad. And this decision, which seemed to counter Teko's original mandate of kind of freezing conflict along a north-south line, would seriously undermine France's credibility among his erstwhile southern allies. On March 10th, negotiations began between the Chadian factions in Kano, Nigeria. N'Djamena was in ruins, and the FAN-FAP coalition controlled most of the city. The Kano talks marked a decisive defeat for Malum, who was forced to resign, while Goukouni was appointed the leader of a transitional government, with Habré serving as defense minister. The peace, however, was only localized and temporary. Repeated attacks by Assil's forces, these were the rebels that were still supported by Libya, and at this point they were actually supported by regular Libyan troops, against positions held by Habré's forces and French forces, were coupled by Libyan military assistance to FAT forces, that's southern Chadian forces in southern Chad. And this threatened the FAP and the FAN, as well as the French deployment, Operation Teko, with a two-front war. It also helped to crystallize the emergence of a de facto partition of Chad between the north and the south, and responsibility for this partly lay at the feet of the French army. General Forest's decision to allow the FAP to enter N'Djamena, which thus helped FAN win the battle, remains very difficult to explain. I spent a lot of time in the archives. I can't find a clear-cut answer. Officials in the French foreign and cooperation ministries were absolutely livid at this. Growing suspicions about France's position in Chad contributed to a rapprochement between Nigeria and Libya. And now Nigerian officials join Libya, so Nigeria also borders Chad, sort of, via Lake Chad, join Libya in accusing France of supporting Habré. And this helped to undermine France's policy, which had aimed to align Nigeria with France in Chad to counter Libyan ambitions, Libyan expansion. And this, they also hoped that Nigerian support would legitimize the French military presence, but now Nigeria was supporting Libyan claims that France was supporting one party in the conflict. And this was a result of Forrest's decision to essentially alter the balance of power in N'Djamena by letting Kekuni's forces into the capital. So, in light of the officially announced policy of strict neutrality, a number of French diplomats and government officials began to share the same concerns about the behavior of the French army. Dallier, for instance, wrote a very sharply worded letter calling for Forrest's removal and his replacement by a more neutral officer. Giscard himself was concerned about Teko's image problem, as well as being unclear himself about his overall mission now. He replaced Forrest with Colonel Pierre de Tonkdek in July, and the lower rank of the commanding officer was also a signal of kind of a political signal that France no longer considered Teko to be a major element of French policy, and tried to downplay its importance, its political importance. Nevertheless, suspicions, of course, remained. In August 1979, the 11 different Chadian factions, so I've only mentioned a few of them, but there are actually more of them. There are 11 different Chadian factions, finally signed a peace agreement of a kind in Lagos. Now, Nigeria and Libya successfully pressured these factions to ensure the agreement stipulated that France would have to withdraw its forces from Chad. At the same time, privately, every major Chadian armed group leader, which is quite remarkable, requested that French troops remain to prevent a dangerous power vacuum from emerging. So this included Habré, included Gekuni, included Malum was no longer in the picture because he had resigned, but the leaders of southern Chadian forces, who were themselves very suspicious of the French, preferred the French to be there than if they had been gone. So faction leaders worried particularly about potential clashes between Gekuni and Habré, and between Habré and the FAT. But none of these leaders could say any of this publicly, for fear of being painted as kind of pawns of French neocolonialism, or as being too pro-French. So, in response to this public call for French withdrawal, Giscard ordered the partial withdrawal of French forces, the remainder of them concentrated in N'Djamena. So there was no longer any kind of defensive line across central. French forces were concentrated in the Chadian capital. Now, two political decisions would fatally compromise the French presence. The first was Giscard's decision in September 1979 to overthrow Jean Bedel Bokassa, the self-proclaimed emperor of the newly renamed Central African Empire. Bokassa had been seeking Libyan financial and military aid in an effort to counterbalance international pressure building against his regime, following the killing of dozens of school children in anti-regime protests earlier in the year. The troops deployed for the operation, which is codenamed Operation Barracuda. The French like to name their operations after fish, at least at this time, were drawn from units stationed in Chad. Now, this infuriated Gekuni, who was the provisional president of the transitional government. Gekuni saw Barracuda as a violation of Chadian sovereignty, and expressed fears that France could decide to do the same thing to him. He very loudly protested, quote, against the use of Chadian national territory as a launching pad for coup d'etat in neighboring or distant countries. And he threatened, again I quote, to draw all of the conclusions called for by this unfriendly act. Now, so not only had France undermined its credibility and trust among southern Chadians who had been the former government of Chad, now they had lost the trust of the transitional Chadian authorities, who had initially but privately asked the French to remain as a stabilizing force. Now, the second decision was a refusal at the beginning of 1980 to agree to Gekuni and Habré's joint request to establish a military base in Faya-Laljau, so in the BET, the capital of the BET. Both Chadian leaders felt that a French military presence in the north could deter Libyan aggression, And this refusal was probably driven, at least in part, by French Army Chief of Staff General Guy Marie, who was opposed to growing French military engagement in Africa and wanted French forces to concentrate more on territorial defense in Europe itself. However, French failure to recommit to securing Chad against Libyan ambitions convinced Gikouni that he could no longer rely on France for protection. At the same time, for him, as for a number of other Chadian factional leaders, it had become increasingly clear that the immediate threat no longer came from Libya, but from Habré. Habré had made no secret of his ultimate desire to seize power. The relative effectiveness of his forces, combined with the disunity of his rivals, made this a real possibility. Uh, in a major reversal of alliances, then, Gikouni began sending feelers to Tripoli, to Libya, to renew his old ties with Gaddafi in preparation for a pending struggle. France's failure to prove a reliable partner or patron meant that, from Gikouni's perspective, he had little alternative than to go to Gaddafi for help. It was in this context that in March 1980, fighting again broke out in N'Djamena between Habre's Fan and this time with the rest of the Chadian transitional government, the Gouvernement d'Union Nationale de Transition, or the GUNT. So the GUNT is the Chadian transitional government composed of 11 different factions, including the Fan. So in March 1980, the Fan started fighting all the other factions within the government. Now, on paper, it looks like they'd be pretty outmatched, but in reality, their forces were far better, far more experienced, and better organized, and better led. Um, Elements of the French Foreign Ministry lobbied hard for Operation Taco to intervene on the side of the GUNT, which was the legally recognized government of Chad. They argued, quote, that Hissène Habre's brutal and cynical behavior, as well as his deep feelings, suggest that if he wins, he's more likely to become a new bloodthirsty dictator than the unifier that Chad needs. Now, that's a very prescient analysis, because that's exactly what Habre became. However, less than a month later, Giscard, in April 1980, Giscard decided to fully withdraw Operation Taco and rejected the idea of a new intervention. Some of his advisors wanted to avoid a new commitment, which would require a massive military presence, and such an intervention would also potentially cost significant numbers of French lives and provoke negative international reactions. This is also in the context of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and the French didn't want to be seen as a Western country doing the same thing somewhere else in Africa. So, additionally, there was a feeling that even a GUNT victory against Habre with French assistance would not by itself end conflict in Chad and would not do much to limit Libyan influence in Chad. So, this led to the French decision to withdraw rather than stick around and actually help the GUNT out against Habre. Now, the following months would prove catastrophic for both Chad and France's overall African policy. Bloody street fighting between Habre and GUNT factions left N'Djamena in ruins. Shortly after the French withdrawal, it became increasingly clear that Habre's better disciplined troops had begun to have the upper hand. By June, Gikouni's feelers to Gaddafi looked like they might have paid off. On June 15th, Libya and the GUNT signed a friendship and alliance treaty, which set the stage for a major Libyan intervention against Habre. Following a severe downturn in the GUNT's military fortunes in October, Libyan units joined the fighting in N'Djamena against Habre. In the BET, Libyan and FAP troops captured Fire al-Aljou from Habre on November 1st, and 3 days later, Gaddafi himself flew into the city in a dramatic public display of Libyan support for Gikouni's forces. And here is a map from French intelligence document outlining the extent of the Libyan intervention. Okay. So Giscard himself faced serious constraints on intervening to contain Libyan advances. Now, if you remember, France's main goal in intervening in the first place in 1970 had been to contain Libya, and now this policy was up in absolute smoke. France, as well as the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which is the main international organization representing African countries, today it's the AU, they had all recognized the GUNT as Chad's legitimate government. The GUNT had now signed a treaty with Libya and called for military support. Under international law, this is something that is, legitimate, at least up to a point. Any French intervention at this stage would stand as a clear violation of international legal principles, potentially costing France diplomatic support of African allies and cause Giscard domestic troubles in a coming election year. He would run for re-election in 1981. However, the massive expansion of Libyan involvement and the threat this posed to broader French interest in Africa would lead to a shift in French policy towards Hissène Habre's embattled Fan. In the short term, though, French policymakers couldn't do much but act as concerned observers. On December 15th, under pressure from reinforced Libyan regular forces with their associated heavy weaponry and air power, Habré managed to expertly extricate himself from Jamina, and managed to withdraw with his forces relatively intact, which was quite a feat. He and some of his troops made their way into neighboring Cameroon, while the bulk of his forces made a fighting retreat across Chad and took refuge in Sudan. Habré lost the battle, but had not yet lost the war. To make matters worse for French policymakers, on January 6, 1981, Gaddafi announced that Chad would merge with Libya to form a single country. And although this merger obviously never happened, it represented a clear declaration of Libyan intent, validating French officials' worst fears. In response, Giscard made the formal decision to begin providing covert assistance to Habré's fan, then in Sudan. This support took the form of several 100,000 francs, which later paled in comparison to American aid to Habré. It also included heavy machine guns and all-terrain vehicles, and some instructors for their use. In conjunction with Sudanese, Egyptian, and South American aid, this helped Habré prepare to wage a guerrilla war against the Libyan army, which was now firmly ensconced in much of Chad. So, from this point onwards, the United States would play an increasingly important role in the country. The November 1980 election of Ronald Reagan to the American presidency meant a far more hawkish approach to Libya in the Carter administration. Reagan's team viewed Gaddafi as a major sponsor of international terrorism, a Soviet client, and as a real threat to the political stability of large parts of Africa and the Middle East. In the early months of 1981, Reagan signed off on a covert assistance program to Habré. His Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, described it as aiming to, quote, increase the flow of pine boxes back to Libya. And this was along the same lines of Reagan's support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, for instance, or later on the Contras in Latin America. The program would eventually total over $10 million. Giscard, however, would not remain in office to see through his policy. On March 10th, 1981, Giscard lost the second round of the presidential election to a Socialist Party rival and longtime opposition leader, François Mitterrand. Mitterrand would later adopt an interventionist policy in Africa and Chad, much in line with Giscard's own, but early in his administration, he looked to distance himself from his predecessor, and indeed he came to power as part of a socialist-communist coalition that had, as part of its electoral promises, promised voters to radically reimagine France's foreign policy. So I'm going to end the presentation here with Mitterrand's election, the Libyan occupation of Chad, the beginnings of a guerrilla movement based in Sudan, beginnings of American support to Hissène Habré, and a new French president. And on that note, I wish you all a good day, and the next presentation will look at what happened through the rest of the 1980s, especially what President Mitterrand was up to. Thank you very much.